Maybe we passed through 4 hospitals and they were like all blocked, all full, until we reached another hospital, which is Mustashfa Abu Jawde. They took her in and they didn't let us go inside to check on her. After maybe 2 hours waiting outside, we had to push, and then after all, we saw her on the table, and no one told us.
Mariana Foudalian lost her sister Gaia in the Beirut blast, one of more than 220 victims who died on August 4, 2020.
For the 5 years, I can say one thing, that we didn't have the time to grieve. We had to fight for justice since day one. We went through a lot these 5 years, and they tried in many ways to stop the investigation, to make the judge stop his work, but we are still continuing. And for me, it's like if we don't ask for it and work for it in a country like here in Lebanon, so we will never reach justice.
5 years later, August 4th has been declared a day of mourning in Lebanon. This is an indicator of how slow things have been in reaching long overdue accountability for the families of the victims. So far, the investigation has not materialized into anything tangible, and the process has been riddled with challenges along the way. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we bring you a more current update on the Beirut port blast ahead of its 5th anniversary. We ask why, so many years later, no one has been held responsible and whether justice for the victims' families is still within reach.
Nobody will accept it that this major dramatic event remains without answers, without a trial, and without a proper judiciary system acting in this respect.
That's Lebanon's Justice Minister Adel Nassar. He took on the role this year in a new reform-minded government under Prime Minister Nawaf Salam. With Mr. Salam himself being the former chief of the International Court of Justice, there's a new sense of cautious optimism that the port blast investigation could finally lead somewhere.
All the citizens in Lebanon have a right to the truth. And it is the duty of the state to give this file a full effort, because we cannot pretend that we have a state and at the same time not being able to address this terrible blast.
The Justice Minister isn't involved in the investigation itself. And in fact, the entire point is for him to be impartial.
We have really to respect the separation of powers in Lebanon, because in a democracy you have this proper separation. I am a minister, I'm not supposed to ask questions regarding the merit of a judge's work.
But in Lebanon, where institutional corruption and political interference have stalled legal efforts for years, the minister has a pretty big burden to carry.
My objective is to make sure that all resources the investigator would need will be made available to him on one hand, and on the other hand to make sure that nobody will interfere to prevent this investigation to continue, and afterwards that the trials occurs also, because the proper accountability is not only to have an act of accusation, but it's also to having a trial.
So who is tasked with investigating the blast and bringing the accused to trial?
So the lead prosecutor in the case is a judge called Tariq Batar, who's had this case since 2021.
This is Jamie Prentice, the National's correspondent in Beirut, who has been closely following the case.
And essentially his job is to investigate and try and find out what happened on August the 4th, 2020, and what led to the events that preceded it. And he's done a number of things. The most important one at the moment is he's essentially, for the past few months, been questioning lots of people. Most of them are extremely senior officials or former senior officials. Earlier this year, we had some French judges and investigators who were on the ground of the explosion site very soon after the explosion in 2020, and they shared some of their findings with him. But ultimately, he's trying to get to the bottom of what happened, still 5 years on.
Before Judge Bitar came, there was another investigating judge, wasn't there? Who was he? And why isn't he there anymore?
His name was Fadi Sarwan, who was also another judge in the Lebanese legal system. And he was removed in early 2021 because there was a lot of political pressure on him. He basically charged two former ministers who are sitting MPs at the moment, who were ministers at the time of the blast. These are seen as, even within Lebanese politics, two particularly, well, should we say, politically connected people. And they just sort of put as much legal challenges and accusations of bias as they could against him. And he was removed and he was replaced by Judge Bitar.
But Bitar himself did face a lot of challenges along the way, right? Even causing the inquiry to be suspended altogether. What happened?
Yeah, it's not something which is specific to a person. It seems to be specific to the job. So when he took this job in 2021, he faced very quickly those same accusations of incompetence and bias that his predecessor had faced. So, for instance, Hezbollah, which actually wasn't named, hadn't had any officials being named in the investigation, but it was very critical of Judge Bitar, as were all of these ministers or ex-ministers and officials who just put more than 20 legal challenges against Tariq Bitar in a bid to just completely stop it. And all of this culminated in September 2021, where basically a protest was organized by Hezbollah and Harakat Amal, which is Hezbollah's sort of parliamentary ally. And it descended into a gunfight, basically, between Harakat Amal, Hezbollah, and some of their opponents. And 7 people were killed. It was very much reminiscent of the sort of sectarian fighting that characterized the civil war in the 70s and 80s. Then not long after that, the case basically ground to a halt.
What happened in 2023 when he tried to resume his work?
So then we get to January 2023, and he tries to reopen it, basically on a legal understanding that he had that meant he could do it. And I remember being outside the Justice Palace on that day, and I was there for 2 days. The first day, there was a lot of happiness, a lot of optimism, because something that the families of the victims always say, that they never had any chance to grieve because almost immediately they were fighting for justice. And they'd had absolutely nothing in the 2.5 years since the blast. So Tariq Bitar opens the investigation, charges a bunch of people, again, including his boss, who was the top prosecutor of Lebanon. Then almost immediately he shut down again when his boss, Ghassan Ouaidat, who was the top prosecutor at the time, issued a travel ban on him and basically just deprived him of all of the rights that he would be able to have as an investigative judge. And you can imagine the anger. And, I remember seeing families of the victims breaking into the judicial palace. Ghassan Ouaidat, the next day, famously went into the judicial palace with special forces as his bodyguards. And it was just chaotic. And it was very symbolic of the constant roadblocks in the investigation that have happened.
What about compensation for the families of the victims? Because we already know that there had been a lot of economic devastation caused to the country by the blast. The country was already in a dire financial state. Has anything been done to provide any financial compensation to people who have lost their businesses, their livelihoods, for example?
Something that we found is that from a business standpoint, lots of people, the answer is no. If you think about when the explosion happened, it was during COVID, so perhaps lots of people weren't doing brilliantly economically anyway. It was about a year after the economic collapse, which was these people basically lost all of their money and they had to rebuild with their own savings. Lots of businesses, especially small businesses that we spoke to, didn't have any insurance. I remember speaking to a number of people last week and they were like, no one from the government ever came to see if they were okay and to offer them compensation. And even if some businesses or homes were insured, it still took a couple of years for that compensation to come through. There were some residential buildings which were supported with aid, but I think it's very much a case of lots of people had to fend for themselves, basically.
This year, Bitar was again reinstated, right, as lead investigator, amid a new political environment in Lebanon that prioritizes reform and accountability, and, of course, with a weakened Hezbollah as well. Has this changed anything with the investigation? Has there been any movement?
I think Tariq Bitar, one of the things that people always praised him about was that he carried on doing his job even in the face of threats from people from Hezbollah, which includes Hassan Nasrallah, the former Secretary General. But I guess you could argue that he has a greater freedom to be able to do his job, and that there is perhaps a greater ability for public figures who Hezbollah don't like to be able to carry out their job with greater freedom than the ability to do it. His powers were reinstated. He was able to do things which sound small, but he was able to use the Interior Ministry, so therefore the police, to be able to execute, let's say, warrants, these sorts of things. In March and April was a lot of those top officials who previously refused to attend hearings, although not all of them, have now gone down to the courthouse and been questioned by him. Now, there is lots of optimism at the moment because of the fact that there appears to be progress, but we still don't know how much progress has actually been made. And for people who lost their families, who lost their loved ones, who lost their friends, their businesses, until you have that final verdict, only then will people who were affected even feel a semblance of justice.
But the obstacles in the Beirut blast investigation are not the exception. For decades, political crisis and opaque legal systems have allowed for a culture of corruption and impunity to thrive in Lebanon. Joining me now is Mohammed Ali Harisi, foreign editor at The National. Ali, going back to the blast itself, how could there be so much negligence in the first place, despite high-ranking officials being aware of the presence of the explosive materials?
I mean, this is Lebanon's story and everything. The country has no real structure in many places. No one knows who controls, for example, the port. There are many competing authorities at the port, in the airport, in the ministries. It's all parties competing for power and for access. So it's really just another chaotic structure in the overall chaotic regime in Lebanon.
What is it about Lebanon's legal institutions and governing bodies in general that would not only allow the blast to happen, but allow 5 years to pass before we even know who to blame for it?
It's not only the port explosion. The port explosion is just another example of how negligence and how no one can be held accountable in a country governed by militias and corrupt political parties. Rafiq al-Hariri was assassinated in 2005. What happened? Nothing. I mean, if it wasn't for the international tribunal, no one would have been held accountable. And even with the tribunal, no one has been held accountable. Many politicians have been assassinated, and many journalists have been killed. Have you ever heard of anyone charged with one of these murders and going to prison? No. And the electricity sector has been in ruins since the 90s, since the civil war ended. All the Lebanese know that the sector hasn't been fixed because there are people benefiting from the chaos and making money out of it. I think the only case, or the biggest case, would have been Riyad Salemi. But Riyad Salemi, it's a different story. He's connected to foreign politicians. It's much bigger than Lebanon.
After seeing all the challenges of investigating the blast, all the deadlocks that have happened, the suspension of the investigation itself, and all the changes, and then most notably since then, the fall of Hezbollah, given the change in the political environment of Lebanon, are we closer now to going back to that moment where we do have hope? And do you think we're closer to a point where that hope actually has results, tangible results that we can see?
Yes, maybe we are somehow hopeful again that things can change and we can start rebuilding the country from scratch. But at the same time, Israel is your neighbor. And as we witnessed in many places in the region, Israel seems to have plans for every country. What's the plan for Lebanon? What's awaiting Lebanon? Hezbollah losing the war has given Israel the upper hand to do whatever it wants. The country is being pressured by Israel and by the US and by France and by many countries to disarm Hezbollah, to rebuild from scratch. But rebuild the country how? On what basis? Is it on normalizing with Israel? No one knows, to be honest. But there is a plan. And when it's an Israeli plan, then most probably it's not a good plan.
When we talk about the trials and the convictions of those responsible, as we said, there haven't been any. Where do you think the victims stand in all of this? Because surely the Lebanese people do want to see a change. They want to see accountability, and that's going to be very validating and very heartening for all Lebanese, but specifically for the victims of the blast who saw a miscarriage of justice for the last 5 years. What does justice look like for the victims' families? And what does the future of Lebanon look like for them, or what do they hope it will look like for them?
Justice is just an idea. They know that even if they keep seeking justice for years and years, one, it's not going to bring back those who they lost or their properties or their loved ones. And two, they're not going to get justice. In a country like Lebanon, you can't expect accountability. It's really hard seeing it happen. Even the judges are being appointed with the executive orders coming from political parties who support them, even if it's not direct. So how can you expect that the legal system will give you justice if it's supported by the people whom their parties or their sponsors caused the blast? It just doesn't make sense. If you're seeking justice, you're trying to hold the responsibles accountable, right? So you would go after, let's say, Hezbollah, the head of the port, people who knew at the port, the prime minister, because he said it, that he knew and he was going to visit the port later. I'm not sure why. The minister of agriculture, because it was said that this was a shipment either to kill people with or to feed people with. The crew of the ship, the captain, the party that ordered the shipment, I mean, basically it's half the executive and half the security institutions, even the army knew. And the head of the army is now the president. So if you're gonna bring accountability, you have to put on trial the whole system. It's not as easy as it looks. And saying accountability is something and delivering accountability or forcing a regime to hold itself accountable, it's a different story.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. This episode was produced by Ben Barkawi with Fatima Al Mahmoud and Jamie Prentice. It was audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Du'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. One more thing before you go, we do want to hear from you. Help us improve our podcast by taking a 2-minute listener survey. You can find the link in the episode's show notes. Thank you so much for listening.